Uh, first, okay. Uh, Let me first thank Professor Whitman and Dr. Ellis for making me available to this lecture, uh, and particularly the Society for Intercultural Philosophy, the University of Tübingen. And I'm really, really privileged that the kind of work that I'm doing, which I consider always as a minority work in the larger scheme of doing philosophy, and at least a group of people are willing to discuss and engage with these views, I feel not only excited, but privileged to be with you. You have already seen the title that I have given, that a phenomenal, can there be, it's a question form, that can there be a philosophical study of indigenous philosophy, or phenomenological study? And let me divide my presentation into two parts. First, this question itself, and many might like to outrightly reject the very possibility of what you call indigenous philosophy. So let me raise this question in the first half of my talk. Can there be an indigenous philosophy at all? And secondly, I would like to engage not bookishly, but certain methodological approach of phenomenology to go through the narratives of the indigenous thought, and then try to bring before you, if we can, think of a philosophy of the indigenous thought. This is what my scheme of presentation today is. Prior to beginning my presentation, first hypothetical position that I would make, and perhaps this is already accepted by many of us, is that philosophy is not one kind, but there are many philosophies. And not only that, there is not one methodological approach of philosophizing, but there are multiple approaches of philosophizing. And I think in the Western tradition, emergence of the continental philosophy and the phenomenology distinctively tells a lot about this multiple approach in philosophizing compared to the Anglo-Saxon tradition. So it is there, out there in the Western world. So I don't get intimidated to even to say and take side that there can be more than one philosophy, and there can be more than one ways of philosophizing. And if we accept this, then I am going to argue towards the end of this presentation certain methodologies which we may otherwise leave it to poetry or similars or mysticism, for instance, as something other than philosophy. And I am someone who is deeply influenced by Heidegger, that the poetic nuances gives a lot to the philosophical thinking and thought processes. That also I keep this as an axiomatic positioning of myself. Now, the question indigenous, who are the indigenous? So when you Google out and study and read what indigenous really mean, you will immediately talk of indigenous population in the Canada, United States, in Africa, in Australia, and similar as what you called, quote unquote, the primitive communities, which have lesser interaction with the rest of the world. So the very idea of this indigenous, or what used to be called a primitive people at one point in the late 19th century and early 20th century, we all know how these people were called and treated, and the colonizing process that you have seen throughout the world. So you have a very clear-cut binary between what you called these people as savages and the other one as civilized. Not a very good word today, but it was accepted quite without any problem that there are people who are you consider as primitive or savages who needs to be civilized. And you call these people, or what we call these people today as indigenous, was a primitive at one point in time. And the qualifier for these people which was being addressed to is that these people were animist. So animism was one of the thought which the anthropology popularly used. And I want to begin with this very idea of animism and how this concept itself has gone a huge shift in connotation over a period of time. Let me remind you that it was in the late 19th century and early 20th century that so much of talk by the anthropologists, whether it is E.B. Taylor, James Fraser, and many more. And then there were also many popular at that point in time, what you call human Jew, where people from Africa and other places were brought and put in the Jew and were illustrated as the missing link between the white man and the apes. And this is a story that we almost have forgotten. But to make my point, I perhaps need to bring this to your consideration. So animism was a concept to these people who you think that believe that there are spirits all around the world, whether living or non-living. So when the European and the Indian, even the British anthropologists and ethnographers came to India, it was even stated that Indian tradition or civil was primitive in the sense that they were all having what you call pagan culture. The pagan culture of worshipping everything around in the world, whether living or non-living, was something that was almost seen with certain contempt and intellectually what you call regressive or not matured enough. So animism at one point in time during the colonial period was something which was dividing the savages. And this is historically located. What you find very interesting in the last few decades and that is what I would like to submit before you. And the two scholars from the West, I would like to read out few lines from their writings. One is of Graham Harvey and others is the word Davis. Graham Harvey's articulation on animism is very interesting. And let me quote him. Animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons.
Bhagat, you are muted again.
Yeah, I think somehow, yeah.
It's okay.
So I was just telling, I do not know when I got muted, but I was just telling that in recent times, much work has come out on animism. And this word, colonial period, which almost was making a dividing line between the savages and the civilized, has come up as a new way of refashioning our thought and philosophizing. And that's what I want to bring out from these two scholars. Graham Harvey's statement, which I found very interesting, is that animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are humans. So not all of them are persons, some are humans, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. And it's quite fascinating that from the traditional way of looking at animism as a belief that the world is full of spirits, and what the Western world thought that this is a very primitive thinking, that even a stone or a mountain or a river, how could that possess spirit? How could it manifest a spirit? Is now being re-articulated by Harvey, that world is full of persons. So you can see a discourse that from the discourse of the spirit and the body, subsequently from the mind and the body, you find here a thought about person, a personhood, which is getting recognition with the contemporary discourses on philosophy. This is one I would like to submit. The second one, which I will present and subsequently I will engage with both. This is from Newry Bird Davis, perhaps she is from Israel, if I'm not mistaken. She writes, if cutting down trees into parts epitomizes the modernist epistemology, let me repeat, if cutting trees into parts epitomizes the modernist epistemology, talking with trees, again, talking with trees, I argue, she says, epitomizes animistic epistemology. To talk with a tree rather than cut it down is to perceive that it does as one acts towards it, being aware concurrently of changes in oneself and the tree. It is expecting response and responding, growing into mutual responsiveness and further possibly into mutual responsibility. This is a new twist of defining or describing animism. And it becomes relevant pragmatically with the time that we are living in, the environmental crisis, our relationship with nature, exploitation, and the kind of life we have made ourselves massed into. I am located at present in Delhi, and I find it extremely difficult to breathe if I go out. The kind of pollution, not only because of industrialization, construction, but also about stable burning, which is part of the agricultural processes, which is huge. And we are also imitating the developed world and knowing or unknowingly that the kind of hazard that we are facing is already into. So the redefining of animism as like what you see in modernist paradigm, the science, what it does methodologically is to dissect and divide the whole into parts and make it more accurate, clear as you divide them into parts. You know more and more about the parts as a scientist. And this, I think you know it better, that Vienna Circle was precisely trying to do this in philosophical thought, of reducing every philosophical language and statement into atomic proposition of is and is not, and how badly they failed that history has shown. So the scientific approach of dividing and cutting down into parts, knowing more and more about the parts and destroying the whole, compare it with what you call the tribal or the indigenous thought, where you are conversing or engaging, talking to the trees, talking with the trees, is a very exciting way what Bert Davis is articulating with the idea of animism. And I say that within, say, nearly 100 years, if you count from late 19th century or beginning of 20th century, now is the end, beginning of the 21st. So within this what you call century, the very idea of animism is taking a major shift, and philosophizing can also accommodate a newer approach to looking at the world around us. So that's what I found very exciting with revisiting of this concept of animism. Having said that, I have my own problems with both the scholars, and that is what I would like to submit. I see that both these scholars are rooted in the Western philosophical world. Though they are sympathetic, they are compassionate with the worldviews of the indigenous communities. But how they look at the indigenous communities is still from a Western paradigm of looking at. The spectacle that these scholars are wearing are still from the European American spectacle, the paradigm. Only shift has been from a contemptuous way of looking at these people. They are more compassionate, readiness to accept. That is the beauty that the shift has taken over. But I see that it is still a Euro-American centric approach to looking at animism. I have 2 points, very quickly I will tell you. But one is theoretical and second is the issues, the content of their articulation. Theoretically speaking, I will borrow from now, let me lay my hand to Martin Heidegger. Heidegger used the word Dasein, and you know it well, perhaps more than me, that he could have used the word self or an authentic being, but why this Da and Sein? Perhaps Dasein is not a very common vocabulary in German language, but he coined one. Because the word self or the Das Man are already carrying baggages of connotations, attributes. And in philosophy, when you take up a concept, a word, a term, those terms carry concepts which are historically rooted, and it is extremely difficult to dissociate yourself from that. Perhaps that could be one reason that Heidegger used the word Dasein rather than something like Das Man, which he differentiates authenticity with the herd or the common man. When you carry, now these two scholars or many more, when they are using the word animism, they are tracing the history of how this concept have come and they try to reconstruct the concept, deconstruct it. Yet the baggage remains, and baggage is knowingly or unknowingly there in the back of their mind. Now let me come to the second point with this argument, is that look at these three concepts. One, the personhood in Harvey, or cutting and dissecting in Bert Davis, or talking or relating, both again in Bert Davis. These concepts are rooted in Western philosophical tradition. The idea of person, for instance, is a deeply debated theme in the Western philosophical narrative, discourses. And they have used it perhaps to gain recognition of the fellow philosophers in the West, and bring their point that animism has much to give, which the West have completely ignored. So their intentions are clean. Yet the process of philosophizing have this lacuna of rooting themselves, grounding themselves in the Western philosophical traditions. And I feel strongly that still we have not been able to enter into the psyche and the worldviews of what you call the indigenous community. So one thing is, like Heidegger, you don't use the word self. You forget about animism. Why you have to be bogged down with this baggage of carrying this word called animism? Think of something else like the indigenous. Can we do that? That is my question. So the first half of my talk that I was submitting before you is this word animism throws open concepts which are philosophically rich and can be discussed and deliberated upon. Either it is in terms of personhood or what you call dialogue or talking. Dr. Ellis has been working on samvad in Indian tradition, in Sanskrit word for dialogue, as a form of philosophizing. So there are multiple ways of philosophizing, and animism, what these scholars call, which I wish to use the word indigenous, throws open some very exciting concepts. And second part of this lecture, which I would like to move on now, is to engage with the word or methods of phenomenology and see. And I'm using the methodology of phenomenology in the broadest possible way. Please do not ask me that, are you a Husserlian? Are you a Heideggerian? Are you a Sartrean? And I have done this for almost last 20 years. And I found that I had done a very less useful work. I could have spent more of my time reading less of Sartre, but I was so, what you call, fascinated and fell in love with these philosophers, only to come out now after I reached 50. Well, if conceptualization is one way of philosophizing, we also know that description, or what you call descriptive ontology, is yet another in which philosophizing has gone on. So you don't have to do logic chopping all the time. You can go into the poetic nuances, which I said a while back, what Heidegger has done. Not to read on the line, but between the lines. And there is much more insight between the language that you are speaking, behind the language that one narrates. And perhaps one way of looking or philosophizing is, what I look at this indigenous tradition is the art of storytelling. Storytelling is something we keep it for literature people to study. And we think that philosophers have to be more rigorous, more rational, and exercise like storytellings are child's activity. The richness of storytelling is what I would like to submit before you. But before I do that, what is important is whose story and who tells the story. That is extremely important. I'm not interested about the identity of the person who tells the story, whether he is an European or whether it is an indigenous person, is it an African or something else. That would be a very unmindful way of looking at. You know, in my part of the country, where when identity politics becomes very strong, I will put this example in your case. If I keep you telling my story, perhaps it will not excite you. What is happening in my place, which if I juxtapose that to your situation, If a German goes and writes a story of the French says, no, we know better how to write our history. We don't need a German to write our history. It is as good as that, what is happening in my place. So who tells the story in terms of identity of the person becomes unnecessarily very sacrosanct. This we need to throw away with. What is important is whose story we are telling. And when we say whose story, it doesn't really matter the identity of the person whose story he is telling. It doesn't matter. And my criticism with Purva Paksha, which in Indian tradition they call it one whom you want to critique, and Bert Davis and Harvey, whom I admire a lot and taking from them, yet I find that their approach to look at the indigenous through the spectacle of animism is short-lived, because the concepts that they are using, the philosophical concepts that they are using are Eurocentric. And I am submitting that they need to come to answer this question, whose story are you telling? And once you enter into this whose story, the phenomenological approach will subsequently emerge. That is what my submission is. Let me tell you one story, which is very fascinating for me. And recently I was in field trip and I found this very exciting one ethnic community, which in Indian parlance, they call it tribal communities, but which I would like to call as indigenous. Adi group, ADI. This community has a creation myth, and their storytelling, I'm using that narrative, I'm using the story, and also applying this method of storytelling before you, thinking that this can also be a way of philosophizing. The creation myth of this community says that all living beings, this includes even not only the human, the animals, even the plants and trees and all whatnot, comes out from the womb of a spirit. And this spirit happened to be female, Pedonani. It's not very important what the name, which we can discuss later. But what is exciting about this story is that all living beings emerges from the one womb. Now, imagination of this community is, of course, it is anthropocentric. I am not denying the fact. The very idea of a womb of a woman, is anthropocentric. Not every living beings come from the womb. But what is interesting is that if you trace your origin to a point where you call it is the womb of the mother, the same womb from which everything else have emerged out, the birth, the creation takes place. Subsequently, the kind of kinship relationship that you have with the nature, with the trees. So I recently went and found this lady, a healer, a traditional healer, and he is also trained in medicine, and he has MSc degree in bioscience, but she is also using the traditional herbs and her own ways of medication. Now, very, very strangely, what you find is the day I reached there was a ceremony of sacrifice of piglets. And the belief is perhaps if you see the process of what you called sacrifice, you might be not very excited. But the underlying thought behind this, what excited me a lot, is that we, the human, and for them it is the Adis, the community, they cut down lots of plantations, the tree, the leaves, stems for herbs as to be used as medicine. So they owe it to the spirit of the forest. So they also need to pray to her that we are extremely sorry, we are cutting it down, but it is with a purpose. It is like a prayer before you cut down the trees. Now, of course, this is more in the symbolic way it is happening. We also know in this part of the world, which Dr. Ellis said, Northeast India, it is nothing less than any other developing world. The trees are cut down by the mafia, timber mafias, drugs, whatnot are happening. Forests are cut down and poppy plantation are taking place. So all things are happening. It is not that, I'm trying to eulogize these communities, but I'm trying to look at the thought processes, the tradition, the traditional belief underlying these philosophical thoughts in tits and bits, which can come out through the narrative of a story. Now, one way of, rationalist understanding could be that what a strange way. This is the most primitive way, that how can all the living beings come from one womb? Which is, of course, I don't think this, and in what you call tribal or indigenous communities do not know how a hen or a pig or other animals or trees and plants grow. But their belief and the imagination that there is a female spirit out of whose womb all the living beings have created is, I think, a very benign thought, a beautiful way of looking at the connectivity, relationship between all living beings. The second story, which I would like to tell you, yet again from the reason that I am talking, and this is a Naga community, a Naga tribe called Ao, who says, and this will be very fascinating, I don't know, I'm only fascinated, I don't know how much you will be fascinated. Their origin story says that all this community, their tribe, has come out of what they call Lungterok, Lungterok. And this means 6 stones, right? So from 6 big stones, the entire community has emerged. So these stones, they believe that 3 are male and 3 are female. So you can see that stones which we know are lifeless from our ordinary perception and the scientific approach to understanding the world, these communities or tribes said, we have emerged, we have originated from these 6 stones, 3 males and 3 females. Now, recently I have written on this, and there are 2 types of narration, explanation that have come from scholars who have worked on this origin myths. One set of scholars are trained in anthropology, social anthropology and so on, sociology, cultural studies. And most of them articulate on the migration theories. So these stones are nothing but symbols of their point of origin. So their world, because these people have not had written documents about they are oral tradition. So orally it has been passed over from one generation to the other. And these anthropologists read that it is all about migration narrative and not so much about creation myths. Okay, this is one way, and they talk about how the imagination of migration get shifted from one point to the other and so on. But I found it very fascinating from a poet called Temsula Au, a lady, a poet from that community, and also a professor of literature. And see even this, how our academic background helps us to see things in a particular way. And this literature writes that, well, they believe that 3 of the stones are males and 3 are females. And I found it so exciting that this creation myth breaks down the binary between the animate and the inanimate. What we consider animate and the inanimate has been broken down by this myth. And we also have in Indian philosophical tradition, like Sri Aurobindo was one who believed that there are spirits in all beings. It is a matter of degrees. Small, big, there are spirits all around. Now, how you look at the idea of spirit, that is something that philosophically needs to be investigated. But I found this too extremely exciting narrative. And yet another one I would submit, and then from there I will move to another point. This breaking down of the ontological binary, I found is very exciting, that the male-female binary has been broken down. The spirit, the animate and the inanimate, the living and the dead, this has been broken down by a narration which says that we all come from stones, which we consider are only things. There is one community which narrates the whole idea of the dance. Dance as a movement, as distinct from stillness. So if the being of the human or the living, it is through this movement. The movement symbolizes life, and that movement, it is in the Meitei or Manipuri tradition, which they call is chatkoi or dance. Dance is a particular synchronic way of human movement, which they consider is a stylized way of living. So it is an aesthetic approach towards how you live. So a joyful life is what living is all about. In order to live, one has to be joyful. And it even originates that the first dance or the movement is in the womb of a mother. The movement of the fetus is being poetically articulated, is the first dance movement of the human. It is in the womb of a mother, the playfulness begins. And the day this body freezes into stillness of death, that is where the life ceases. So it's a very beautiful approach of articulating life in terms of movement and dance as a joyfulness of movement. And I find that this storytellings throws open lots of ontological positioning, which we can really look through poetry and through narratives, philosophizing through poems and aesthetics. Let me try to now come towards the end of my deliberation, which phenomenologists have, particularly existentialist phenomenologists have been harping on, is the world of what you call the embeddedness. The embedded world from which the being cannot be separated. And you find this so closely narrated in the stories to the songs of these communities. The whole divide between the body and the spirit even is seen as embedded. We know that the whole idea of divide between spirit and the body, subsequently the Cartesian shift from spirit, no more a spirit but a mind, and then you try to talk about an ontology, yet a duality, and then you come to later philosophers, French philosopher, to talk about the embodied consciousness and so on. You have a history, long history. But you find that the whole idea of embeddedness, whether it is about the spirit, which I call non-bodily, and bodily. I am not very keen to borrow from Sartre or Merleau-Ponty to talk about, body subject and so on, because these communities believe that there is spirits. But I would like to put it that make a division between the body and what is non-body, because we don't know what spirit is, but we know there are things which are non-bodily, right? So unlike this 20th century modern Marxist influenced French existentialist, I would like to submit that the embeddedness in these ethnic communities, either it is about the bodily or the non-bodily, are all in this world. Even it is a world which you ordinarily live, or a world you imagine to live. Because if we look even to our personhood, we know it well, and we already study in philosophy that my being is largely what is consisted of the non-being, what I imagine, what I propose to do. It is not only about a descriptive bodily explanation that I am explained. I am what I imagine. I am what I dream. I am the project is part of me. My project is part of me. So if you give room to the world of imagination in the construction of the ontology of the being, then the whole bodily and the non-bodily narratives are in this embedded world, in this ontology. That is all that I submit. I will not go further. I have already taken around 50 minutes. Do I still have time?
Yes, you can speak at least 10 minutes more if you wish.
Okay. What I found much more interesting about this mode of philosophizing, which I called storytelling as a one way of telling the philosophy of these communities through their poetry, through their narratives or dances, is about what you call breaking up the ontological binaries. And that I found is extremely fascinating. Though in your ordinary life, people know that there is a distinction between the animate and the inanimate, the male and the female. But the world of imagination, where this origin is not so important about where you really came from. The myth should not be seen what you call in the scientific descriptive approach of verification, that this narrative is true or false. But myth tells you some story other than what it tries to show. And what is important about the myth is talking about your imagination of how you wish to be to a past which you have never seen. I mean, in Heidegger's term, what he calls you are thrown into this world. You don't know, you have never seen your own birth. Only your parents tells you, the elders tells you we are born to this mother. All that you realize that I'm already in the world. So how do you tell the myth of your past? Certainly it is not about a scientific explanation to a point of origin, certainly no. But this myth tells about what the community imagines itself to be. So what you imagine to be, you put it as the point of origin, of which nobody has seen. So this, either it is about the past of a memory, or it is about a future which you have not yet seen. it is both a creation of human imagination of your present. And that present through which the story keeps telling tells a lot about how you wish to be, how you look at this world. And that is what I found most exciting ways in which you look at trees and plants. And perhaps I can add one more narrative, very exciting. And I found that this was also practiced in many parts of India. But initially I found this narrative in one community in the Northeast India, is that when this community goes for hunting, when the person goes for hunting, and he shows the prey in front of it, it could be a deer, it could be a bird, you have to sound the prey. The deer or the bird is a prey whom you are going to kill for food, right? But you don't just shoot it. You make the prey aware and let it run for its life. And then the chase begins. And it says it is Kenya or unethical if you kill your prey without sounding it, without letting it aware that I have come to kill you. It's at least you throw something and give a chance for it to flee. And then you challenge and you chase and kill as your food. So killing, unlike many, this thought is not saying that killing is wrong, killing for food, but you also give a chance to live to the other, the one you are going to kill. And this comes very interestingly from a community who has been called by a German writer, I'm missing that point, a name, as a Nagas, the head hunter, naked Nagas. So when the European anthropologists and ethnographers went to different parts of the world, they only saw that people were naked. They were killing each other, but perhaps could not see that they also have a moral world which they live and cherished. And unless you tell a story built on whose story that is, not in the way the Bert Davis and Harvey has told the story of animism from the Western European paradigm, perhaps it is high time that we go to the roots of what these communities think in terms of whose story we are going to tell. Who is telling is not very important, but whose story we tell perhaps will give still a phenomenological take. And with this, I think I will wind up and let me hear your comments and questions, contest. I would love to engage with you. Thank you.